We are talking to Angus McNelly. He is an honorary research fellow, editor at Alternatus, and a professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. Angus, thanks for talking to us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on.
So we wanted to start the conversation with with how it was that labor and social movements in Bolivia, how they operated in the political context and before the election of the MAS government. We'll be talking about that and their relationship to the government of the movement to socialism in Bolivia and further there. But first, I just wanted to kind of get an understanding of what it was like for the labor and social movements, and specifically the labor movement, before the election of Morales in 2005. So if you could give us kind of that background.
So I think the first thing to say about Bolivia is it's a really heterogeneous, diverse country, and it historically has a really weak state. So civil society has been a really, really important part of the direction historically that the country's taken, particularly after the 1952 revolution, where you saw a coalition of working class groups, indigenous groups, and the middle classes overthrow the government and set up what was called a national revolutionary government. And there were two poles to that government. The first was made up of middle class intellectuals, but importantly, the labor movement made up the second pole of this. They call it the National Revolutionary State, which went from 1952 until the implementation of neoliberalism in 1985. And this is because Bolivia had basically the strongest Trotskyist movement of anywhere in the world. So Trotskyism arrived by the railways, start of the 20th century, and quickly became the kind of ideological kind of centerpiece to the labor movement, particularly in the mines. So Bolivia is a country where tin mining was an important part of their history, and they used to read Marx down the lines. And they were super radical, were able, even during the military dictatorships of the 60s and 70s, to kind of play an important part politically, and were kind of played a salient role in the struggles against the implementation of neoliberalism. So the labor was widely defeated across Latin America in the 1980s, but in Bolivia this was particularly the case, and the Central Obrera Boliviana, which is the labor central, suffered huge defeats in the 1980s, particularly in Catamarca, where that was their kind of last hurrah, which was around the same time that the British miners were defeated. However, they were displaced by an important rising indigenous movement. Bolivia is a country where over half of the population, it's difficult to say how many percentage-wise are indigenous or not, because the way that it's measured changes all the time. But over half of the country is indigenous. And there has been a really, really important indigenous movement from the 1960s onwards. And this originally wasn't an identity politics-driven movement. It was a class-based, came out of a kind of radicalization of the peasant movement, and was based in kind of syndicalist traditions. So the Vis-A-Vis, which is the peasants' union, was joined to the Central Obrera Boliviana, the COP. And the most radical part of this peasant movement from the 1980s onwards was the coca growers, the cocaleros, because when people left the mines, as they were privatized and closed down after 1985, people had nowhere to go, there was no way to make money, and so people left the mines and went to the Chapare, which is where they grow cocoa. So they brought this radical kind of like Trotskyist tradition and then used it to organize these peasant movements. So the cocaleros became the kind of radical heart of the peasant movement, and in the 1990s, there was this debate that was like, should we try and build a state within a state? So like the Zapatistas in Mexico, or should we build a political instrument and try and take state power? And they opted for the latter, and the movement towards socialism, or the MAS, is the party that they formed, which comes from the cocaleros, which is why Evo Morales was the head of the 6 federations of the tropics of Cochabamba, which is the coca growers confederations. In the 1990s, neoliberalism destroyed Bolivia's economy, Bolivia's particularly kind of the social fabric of the country, and the deleterious effects that this had exploded during the late 1990s with the fiscal crisis of the state, which led to movements initially against the privatization of water, but also against land tenure, against trying to stop the cultivation of coca, and most famously in 2003 against the exportation of gas through Chilean seaports. Okay, and these peasant movements were really, really important in being the organizational base of this cycle of social movements. So interestingly was the labor movement, which kind of re-emerged during this period of struggle and actually formed part of the kind of like ideological apparatus that helped direct these social movements in the months running up to the October 2003 gas war. So you have a period of 5 years from 2000 to 2005, which laid the foundations for Evo Morales' government, where you had large sections of civil society which were mobilized, a radical set of demands which were largely centered on the nationalization of hydrocarbons and a constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution that formed the base of the initial Morales years. And so Morales kind of rode to power off the back of this social movement radicalism and found himself once in power at the head of a country which was already mobilized. And so in that sense, like, yes, he came to power in a strong position, but the period before him, this 5-year period of social movement activism, really shaped kind of politically where he could go in the first couple of years of his tenure.
Right. I noticed in the latest article that you wrote that it seemed like there was a lot more movement in the first 5 years than there was in the latter portion of his tenure. If for no other reason than the fact that they did a lot of the things that the social and labor movements were asking for. I was wondering if you could kind of tease out the difference and the interplay for us between the labor movements on the one hand and the social movements on the other, because here in America, the labor movement has really been defanged, especially in places here like Alabama. We represent nearly 1 in 10 workers here in Alabama, but even those 1 in 10 workers are, we're certainly not organized on a political basis, even if we're organized in our workplaces for gains on the job. We are definitely not organized to put forward political candidates or push political candidates over the top. We're very heterogeneous as far as our political beliefs here in Alabama. And there's not a lot of interplay between us and other social movements. I think for the worse, but what is the relationship between those two movements and before and after the election of Evo Morales in 2005?
So it depends on which social movements you're talking about. So as I said before, the Vis-A-Vis, or the Peasants Union, is actually a part of the COB. So you have a very close relationship between this Peasants Union and the labor movement. And the Peasants Union is predominantly the way in which rural communities organize themselves in the lowland valleys of Cochabamba, which is where cocoa is grown, but it's also historically where lots of agricultures are. So the food that was grown for the mines, the silver mines that the Spanish run from the 16th century onwards, that food was grown in Cochabamba. And then the areas around the lake, Lago Titicaca, also have peasant unions and this union structure. It gets more complicated as you go further down the Andes because you have what is called an AYU, which is a kind of socio-political social unit that the Aymaras use. So in some communities, they call themselves AYUs now because of the recognition of indigenous groups by governments under neoliberalism. Some of them call themselves peasant unions. they're exactly the same in terms of their day-to-day functioning. It's that they choose which one to call themselves at different times in order to have different access to the state. There have been moments where historically there have been moments of tension between the labor movement and the indigenous movement. But what you have to remember is Bolivia is a really indigenous country. All of the miners are poor. All of the working class people are basically indigenous people. So the miners come from and have family in rural communities. And so historically, there has always been an overlap between the mining community, who are the vanguard of the Bolivian working class, and indigenous communities, particularly in Oruro and Potosi, which is where all of the tin mining and silver mining happened. So there is this massive overlap between the two. Where it gets more complicated is where, if we look at the lowland movement, so there's kind of, if we roughly split the indigenous movement into three broad types. Firstly, you've got the peasant movement, which is linked to the labor movement. And then you've got the highlands indigenous movement, which is in the Andes, that have this, based around this socio-political unit of the Ayu. And then the lowland movements, which are headed by the Guarani, but there are much more ethnically diverse and have a very, very different conception about the world, and far less numerous, far less densely populated, and lots of them still live in very, very remote areas that haven't been integrated into colonial systems of food production in the same way, roughly speaking. So there have been moments, and you see this in particular with the demand for the nationalization of gas, which was central to highland indigenous movements and the work and the labor movement, really going against the lowland movement in certain instances, because all of the gas is in the lowlands. So the people who are displaced and lose their territory or have their rivers polluted by hydrocarbon extraction are members of the lowland movement. And so this tension between kind of different worldviews, different ideas about what you should do with resources really comes out if we kind of look at it. And this is a kind of a broad brush picture of the different social movements you find in Bolivia. But just to illustrate that there are moments where there are real tensions behind kind of like what they're all trying to do. And these tensions you can see in the government of Evo Morales.
Right. And you mentioned that the Peasants Union was part of the COB, and the COB is again, we can think of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of that as kind of like the AFL-CIO of Bolivia. Obviously, the COB is more, radical and more militant than the AFL-CIO, but I think that can kind of help us put it into context for, our American audience.
So when we're talking about these independent groups, what kind of percentage for the listeners are we talking about, of each kind of like, a rough estimation of each group, and then the combination of those groups compared to the remainder of the population?
That is a really good question. I can sketch out and I think it's actually useful to sketch out the Bolivian working classes who've changed in composition under neoliberalism, where you had the size of the working classes increased by 50% in 5 years, as particularly women, but also people from the countryside were drawn into informal work. And you see in the 1980s and 1990s, people who are drawn into wage labor, there aren't any formalized work. All of the miners, 27,000 miners, lose their jobs. There are no formal jobs, and so everybody goes and works in commerce or services, which are informal. The COB does not represent most of these sectors. So the COB still has a big problem in that it doesn't represent most of Bolivia's working classes. And the weight that it holds within society is still because it symbolically is an important part of Bolivian civil society, rather than it represents most of the workers. If you look at where kind of the dynamism within the Bolivian economy is, it's hydrocarbons, but it's been really difficult for the COB to mobilize gas workers, partly because of the way in which hydrocarbons was privatized in the 1990s, where they fragmented the production and into kind of different companies upstream and downstream, which meant that kind of like to build solidarity was really difficult. You only had a very, very small number of workers actually employed in gas, and there wasn't the same history of radicalism. And so you have a disconnect where the most radical sector of the working class is still the miners, but they have been under attack since the 1980s. The state mines that there are still open, Wanuni is a case in point, lose money and are there for political reasons. The ones that do make money are private, and most miners are cooperative miners who aren't represented by the COB anyway. And so you have this situation where the miners are really fragmented and at times fight one another. And you see this in 2007 when Wanuni is nationalized after a fight between the formalized employees of the company, the mining company, and cooperative miners, which kills 30 people because they're fighting with dynamite, because all miners in Bolivia have dynamite. To kind of the battles over the new mining law, which passed in 2013, where the cooperative miners were really pushing to be able to have partnerships with foreign firms. And the state didn't want that. And the state miners were saying, no, we should nationalize everything. And the cooperatives are, no, because we're going to lose money. So you have this situation where, like, historically, the vanguard of the working classes is fragmented and fighting one another. The people who actually make money, whether it be it for the state through fiscal resources or for private capital, have no history of labor organizing and are fragmented because of the way in which their sector is organized, which means that you have a very, very weak labor organization. And then on top of that, it depends on the estimates, but between 60 and 80% of Bolivians are informally employed anyway, and so are not represented by the COB. So this is a moment where, like, the COB is historically quite weak. Compared to certain sections of the peasant movement, particularly the cocoleros, who continue to be important because that sector continues to absorb surplus labor populations who can't find work anywhere else. And coca, because it can be grown all year round, you can have 4 harvests a year, you can make more money than other cash crops. I'm not saying that everybody who works in the Chapari is a narcotraficante, but they're all involved in the drugs trade. They're peasants, but what they make is the raw ingredient for cocaine. And this is an important part of the Bolivian economy because there's no other work for these people to do. And that's the way to survive. And it's actually this tacit kind of agreement between the Evo Morales government, who obviously is led by a coca grower, and the rest of society saying, well, this has to continue because it's political suicide to address it, because you need to kind of then redress kind of why do we have a surplus population which is so big it can't be absorbed, and what do you need to do in order to kind of think about what needs to happen to try and reintegrate this surplus population into society. And the Americans suggested that they grow avocados, and they were, well, you make a tenth of the price. This is not going to work, which is why no neoliberal government has an answer to this question, which is really interesting. And the MAS have been actually quite successful in having these agreements where they are allowed to grow coca, but they've limited the number of hectares they're allowed to grow. And they've actually been more successful than their neighbors who've had a very militarized approach to coca growing in order to contain it. So this is an important part of the story that we're telling, because these coca growers are still like the backbone of the peasant movement, and they're the backbone of the MAS. They're in Bolivia, they talk about the MAS having an organic relationship with social movements. What they mean is this relationship isn't constructed through alliances, it's not constructed through clientelism or cooperativism. It's a relationship that comes from the fact that these two organizations are fused. They're one and the same, basically. You can say this about the cocaleros. And you can say this about the Vis-A-Vis because the cocaleros are part of the Vis-A-Vis, and you can say it because of the mass because the mass is their political instrument. You cannot say this about any other of the social movements that were seen as the base of Morales' government. And this includes the COP. So the COP have a quite kind of fractious relationship with the mass. Sometimes they are in alliance, sometimes they're against them. It's not something which is easy. And it's been actually one of these kind of debates within the labor movement when I was there in 2016, 2017, was should we follow our historical relationship with the state, which is we need independence of the working classes. The COB is a counterbalance to government. So our job is to fight for the good of the working classes through holding the government to account, be it a military dictatorship or an allied kind of nominally socialist government. Or on the other side of saying, look, we're historically weak. We need to look after the COB, which means that we can't fight the government. We have to enter into alliance, and we have to use the fact that this is a historically quite friendly moment and get what we can while we can. And this was like quite contentious. And while I was there, this relationship was breaking up because they had been in alliance since November 2013. And they actually broke that alliance while I was there. And I was in some of the meetings where they discussed why they were going to break it.
So you said in a couple places, this is a historically weak moment for the COB. When you say this, do you mean today, 2020, or do you mean 2005 when Morales was elected?
I think sadly the COB is weaker than it's ever been. I went back last summer, northern summer, so June, July 2019. And the idea behind me going back was I wanted to disseminate some of my findings with people in the labor movement, to be like, look, this is what I found out. This is what I think about what has happened. Do with it what you will. But knowing people in the Bolivian labor movement, my friends in the labor movement, they're really well read. They're really sharp. Like, been in reading groups with them. They're good people. Sadly, everybody that I knew had been expelled and purged when I was there because it was in the run-up to the 2019 elections. And they were like, well, no, we needed to get our house in order. Everybody's with the mass now.
When you say expelled and purged, you mean from the movement?
No, my friend got fired. Quite literally, she worked for the National Healthcare Service, and so they were like, how do we get rid of her?
Oh, wow.
I know what we can do. If we make her lose her job, then she can't be a part of the union anymore, which means that she can't be a leader. So the mass were quite authoritarian in the way that they ran their party ranks. And I think you have to understand that Morales comes from a tradition in the cocaleros, and you see it in the labor movement beforehand as well. It's very hierarchical, and you hold your position on being a good orator and seen as being like charismatic and a good leader.
It's the same here. Yeah.
Yeah, but you battle people in debates, and there were a couple of people who were seen as rivals to him, Alejo Belis and Felipe Quispe, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And not only when they came up against him did they lose, but he made sure that they left politics. Yeah. He does come from this history of organizing where you keep your house in order. And there's a Latin American historical tradition within movements that externally, particularly at times where you think you're going to come up and stress, i.e. elections, you have a united front, nobody says a word. And the way that they did that before I got there was they decided that they were going to purge all the dissident voices. The problem that they had was to do with the way that they'd managed or the mass government had managed social movements under Evo Morales' government. So they spent the first term taking the radical demands of social movements and trying to implement them, but implementing them through a liberal state and in a way that would keep their radical appearance without actually shaking anything up. So you had the nationalization of gas that did renegotiate contracts, which meant that the government was able to gain a larger slice of hydrocarbons rents. But in terms of ownership, Petrobras and Repsol kept most of their gas fields. They actually increased their share of hydrocarbons production in Bolivia. This is not a nationalization on anyone's book, but it looks like one. Similarly with the Constituent Assembly, the way that the Constituent Assembly was organized as firstly with a liberal elections for all of the representatives who had to participate as a member of a political party, 2/3 voting needed for all of the proposals. All of this was set up in order to take kind of different forms of political organization and more radical ideas and put them through this liberal machine that meant it came out the other end with a kind of a compromised outcome, shall we say. And as you know, it's really difficult to mobilize people if you're mobilizing around the nationalization of hydrocarbons and a Constituent Assembly. Both of those things have happened. You can't mobilize people after that. And you can't say, oh no, we didn't like that, let's go back and do it again. This is not going to get people organized, mobilized. And so what started to happen was that you had the two main kind of organizing frames that movements had that were then taken away from them. You had leaderships who were offered initially positions in kind of the mass cabinets, but then later on just mid-level bureaucracy, like you go and you work for a government organization, a government department in the area that you're interested in, and so you may be able to have some input on a day-to-day level with the implementation of policy. But as a movement, you've just cut off the heads of these organizations. And what has happened, what I saw happening was that whereas before you had the social movements and then there was a gap and then there was the state, now you have the social movements and then, or under the Morales years, you had the social movements and their leaders and the government in like one little bubble, and then a massive gap, and then you had the rank and file. And the rank and file couldn't get to their leadership. And so you had these like headless kind of movements that stopped moving. So you had these organizations that became empty shells as the activists kind of like all of the energy dissipated. There was some rumblings, like moments of sparks where you could see there was massive discontent, and they kind of like congealed around certain issues. So you saw that with proposed eliminations of fuel subsidies at the end of 2010, the construction of a highway through one of the national parks, the Titneys, which really undermined the government's support among particularly like lowland groups, but helped build coalitions between lowland groups and sections of the urban middle classes and the aspirational working classes, who started to see themselves as, or their children, university educated, worthy of professional jobs, and so they kind of aligned themselves less with the kind of extractive agenda of the mass, more with kind of like the environmental agenda of the lowland movement and the environmental movement, which has been quite elitist up until now. And so when in 2019, I came back and I saw all my friends had gone from the COB, I was thinking, well, what's left? So all of the activists I knew who were like good, who had like good support amongst the people that they represented, they'd all been replaced by kind of people aligned with the government who didn't have support amongst their organizations. So when the coup happened, you see this really clearly on the 10th of November, as the military's, just before the military says to Morales, you need to step down, the COB comes out and says, you need to step down. So the COB ends up supporting the coup because they're historically weak and they spent the last like couple of weeks flip-flopping around while there's kind of like the whole country's up in flames, and they don't have the ability to mobilize people in support of the government. They don't have ability to mobilize people against kind of fascist forces who are mounting in the right. And by the time that Evo's gone and the new president, Janine Áñez, comes into power wielding a Bible, flanked by members of the far right, members of the COP are thinking now, well, we've made a mistake. And a week later, we made a mistake. This is not good enough. But it's a symptom of the fact that it's become an empty shell, or it had become an empty shell. And it doesn't represent its constituents. And it is unable to do the one thing that the COP needs to do in order to have power, and that is mobilize the working classes.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that, now my understanding, and obviously as a kind of lay English reader of Bolivian news, there's not a whole lot of English language news coming out of Bolivia, and then it's hard to kind of pull out the threads that are important. But my reading of it has been that the labor movement has been pretty central to the resistance to the coup government. Now, I've been reading these things more lately over the last several months, where what you were talking about when they, the COB initially supported the coup, encouraging Morales to step down. But over the last several months, my understanding is that they've been blockading roads. There's been general strikes. There has been lots of mass militant action on the part of labor unions and social movements in Bolivia. Do you see that? What does that mean kind of for the strength of the COB and these other labor and social movements? And do you see that as indicative of a rise, or is this something of a fluke, or am I just misreading the situation?
Bolivia is a place where you always have people on the streets. Okay. It's a place of protest, and this is partly symptomatic of you have a state which cannot properly govern the country, and a democratic system which sits really, really uncomfortably on top of the heterogeneous society that I outlined before. So you always have politics that spreads out onto the street. What is interesting is if you go back to last November, so after Evo Morales fell, you had these moments of spontaneity. And this, in Bolivian history, you have moments which are explosive, which aren't managed by organizations or particular movements, that they start to move. And so you have organizations which are carried off the back of these spontaneous kind of moments. And what you start to see when Morales leaves and the Áñez government comes in, burning the Huipala, which is the indigenous flag, is people get really angry. And so you have these mass kind of like mobilizations against this government in El Alto, which is a largely Aymara city which sits above La Paz. And they start marching through the streets calling for a civil war. This isn't organized by anyone in particular, much less the mass political party. They have no power to control this. But because it's spontaneous and because you don't have the organizational structures, they can't really mount an effective, sustained moment of pressure. And what you see is the state come in and use a significant amount of violence, which kills dozens of people. But whereas in 2003, where people are mobilized, that violence was the spark that lit the whole powder keg and got rid of the president. This time you didn't have the social organizational structure in order to kind of resist what was going on. In the end, it kind of dampened those moments of resistance. So same in the cocoa growing region, where you had the military go and use really kind of violent, lethal force against cocaleros, or the cocoa growers who were mobilizing in favor of Morales. And yes, this has become a really important rallying cry now and in the run-up to the elections, these human rights abuses. But at the time, it didn't kind of, whereas before it would have spurred movements on and kind of like enlivened and enlargened moments of action. In this period of time, you see the opposite, whereas this violence was effective for a short period of time of curtailing these kind of moments of kind of spontaneous action.
So it sounds to me like you said the COB had a hand in that, but it looks like as the mines have difficulties or have continued to have difficulties, that the COB slowly loses, the power that it once wielded, if it did, have a strong amount of power. And it sounded like they're going to the Cocoleros. As far as industry goes, it don't sound to me like there's a lot of opportunity. I'm going to show my ignorance here and say that Bolivia, like most of the other South American countries, have agriculture and petroleum, and that's about it. So, where do they go from this point? Because and then I guess the second part of that question would be, as those folks move into the Cocoleros, are they seeing the type of violence that's inflicted upon them through U.S. imperialism, like what we see in other South American countries trying to so-called stamp out the drug trade? Because I'm more interested in the people and how you get these people into a better quality of life. And maybe under a more liberal government in the U.S., you don't see quite that much overreach into the Bolivia, but I don't see it ever stopping. And it's like you take away all of their ability, or most of their ability as they transition out of these more traditional working roles in mines and things like that into the fields, which is, I would assume, comes extremely natural to them.
The question of U.S. imperialism is really important. And it's interesting because liberal government, conservative government, there are differences between, particularly like in the 1980s, the Republicans mounted an effective kind of war of terror on Central America. But the war on drugs in the 1990s, yes, it started under Reagan, but it was continued with kind of vigor under Clinton. And what changed things was Morales coming into power and having a new approach to drugs. And the drugs trade in Bolivia is run by unions. You don't really have cartels. In the same way that you have in Brazil or Colombia. So the unions themselves sort out all of the disputes in their own meetings. And as far as I understand, it's this unwritten rule where everybody knows you're talking about drugs, but it's not explicitly said about drugs. And when a decision's been made in the union meeting, you don't go back against it because they can take your land away. And these people are primarily peasants, and their involvement in the drug trade is possibly to make the paste, which is like the first step of making cocaine, and possibly to transport it to other places. But cocaine is not really made in Bolivia. They make the paste and then they export it. And because of this strong union control, it means you don't have the same level of violence that you have in other parts of Latin America. Bolivia is very formed, but in comparison to its neighbors, it just doesn't have the same levels of violence. And this is partly because it has very, very strong civil society organizations, which play a large part in organizing people's everyday lives. So the COB, it doesn't have the structural power that it once had. And it's, as far as I can work out, unless things change with the structure of the hydrocarbon sector, I don't think that the COB is going to have massive structural power again. What it does have is associational power, the ability to bring sections of the working classes together, and a huge historic importance. So if you read the Bolivian newspapers, the COB is in, people say the COB is unimportant, yet it's in the newspaper every day. And this was what led me to start writing about the COB, because I was like, hang on a minute, how is this organization unimportant? Nobody in English had written about it for years before I wrote about it a couple of years ago. And I was like, well, why? This is one of the principal organizations. It's always in the news. You have people who can have meetings with government officials. And there are people talk about what's going on in the COB. And if the COB's marching, they have sticks of dynamite, you know they're marching. So there is this kind of still this historic weight that the COB pulls. And still, if you look at the last year, I don't think they were leading the protests against the Anya's government, the interim government. But they were an important kind of visible kind of lightning rod for international solidarity, for other kind of labor movements across the world to understand what's going on, but also kind of a rallying cry around which people can come. If you know the COB's going to be there, they have a history of marching with other people. And my favorite story about the COB, and this sums up, they had an amazing leader for 30 years, a guy called Juan Lechin, who was Minister of Mines in this National Revolutionary Government in the 1950s that I was talking about before. And the British Labour movement gave the COB £1 million in the early 80s, like 81 or 82, to build themselves a new social seat, so a union like headquarters in La Paz. And then I think it must have been 82, 83, because the British miners' strike was 84, and the COB didn't spend a penny and gave all of it to the solidarity funds back to the British miners when they went on strike.
Wow.
And
That's
this
beautiful.
Story,
That
always
is beautiful.
gets me, because like the Bolivian miners have nothing. And then a couple of years ago, the same thing happened to them. But such was their sense of solidarity that they were like, well, obviously we're not spending a penny on this. It doesn't matter if we don't have an head office. Our comrades in the UK need this more than we do. Let's give the money to their strike fund. And this is part of the reason why I think the COB it continues to be important, because it is historically one of the strongest Trotskyist movements in the world. It does have these like amazing tidbits of like international solidarity. And it is a route in for leftists around the world to grapple with what is a really complicated set of social movements and kind of like social terrain in Bolivia. To have this, well, there is this labor movement, it is really important. Here's why it's really important. And I think that will continue whether it has structural power or not.
So you said though that you're not sure that you really see a path for gaining stronger structural power for the COB?
Not unless you have a radical overhaul of their entire economy, and I don't see that happening either. Because from what I see is the majority of the working classes will continue to be informalized and work in services or commerce. I don't see kind of any kind of route forward. The way their insertion into the global economy as a producer of primary commodities has only deepened under Evo Morales. And even though you have a better educated working class, there isn't the capacity to produce jobs. And I don't see the type of jobs as David mentioned, like the industrial sector in Bolivia is basically like foodstuffs and some light industry. They try to make like polypropylene like pellets, which is like the plastic But in terms of like where they're going to fit into kind of manufacturing, I don't see them being able to kind of increase their manufacturing base. And in terms of services, I don't see them building a formalized service sector which has any ability to have structural power, because most of their informal services and commerce, well, the services are the least domestically orientated. The commerce is more interesting because it's at the center of a region-wide distribution of goods, which is part of the survival strategy of the working classes, but it also means that social reproduction in Latin America can happen. So if you didn't have people importing cheap goods from China through these really informal channels or secondhand goods from the United States, then you would have large kind of a political cauldron because nobody could survive. So it's this really interesting kind of like subsidy or subsidizing kind of cheap price of labor in Latin America through these networks. But again, like I don't see this changing anytime soon. And I don't see this changing with the government of Luis Arce, even though Arce is ex-finance minister of Evo Morales. He assumes office in a couple of days. But if we're talking about whether it's going to be a change of direction that will lead to a complete overhaul of the country's economy, I just don't see it.
So that kind of leads me to the question. You answered the part about the industrialization, and that leads me to the question that I always struggle with, especially in South America. What we've seen in Mexico, in America for the past since the 80s with NAFTA and CAFTA and things like this, opening up free trade, and in the U.S., it's always under the guise of we're going to help these people establish a more industrialized society, when in fact what we see is a highly exploitative, ultra-capitalist system of where these extremely rich companies move into and buy cheap, almost free land and exploit the people. Just is, to me, from what I see, is sickening. So, from your perspective, you've been on the ground there. What is your opinion of this? Because we get on the neoliberal side, even the Democrats, which we consider fairly liberal people in the U.S., have a lot of times have a very lofty idea that this is helping these people, and I don't see it that way.
Neither do I. I agree that for free trade in Latin America has led to the lost decade in the 1980s and 1990s. And quite often these agreements led to the maquiladores that you were mentioning before, where you have industrialization, but industrialization for whom? So you have factory plants that are set up in order to exploit cheap labor, where particular localities are inserted into global commodity chains as a particular node because it has cheap labor.
Yeah.
The really interesting thing at the moment is that particularly South America, and I know more about South America than Central America, is that you have the continent is, yes, it's a massive source of natural resources, so foodstuffs, agro-industry, kind of beef, wine, soya in particular, or minerals, gold, and hydrocarbons. But other than that, it's not really, because of shifting kind of global labor, global production regimes, where you start to see an orientation towards China. Latin America is not really kind of linked into these kind of sprawling production networks, or at least South America isn't. And the industrial processes you see in South America are much more like production in Argentina and Brazil and Chile for other parts of South America, not the kind of like Southeast Asian, Chinese model where kind of like that's being exported to the rest of the world. And I think this is Interesting. And I say it's interesting because I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, in the sense that it could offer a political opportunity, because neoliberal governments just don't have an answer to what's going on in Latin America at the moment. And in my opinion, Latin America is currently in the wash of the 2008 crisis, which hit the region in 2013 with the fall of commodity prices. And you have these countries where maybe not in terms of their GDP proportions, but in terms of like where surplus is produced. Surplus is produced by export-orientated primary commodity extraction. And because the price has been historically low, it's been really difficult for states in order to maintain fiscal balance. And there's no political will for austerity. And so you start to see a fracturing of alliances between state and capital and kind of increasing kickbacks against austerity or against rise in public services in other parts of Latin America. So Brazil 2013, the spark for the crisis that led to the fall of Dilma was a rise in bus fares. In Chile, the same, the rise of the subte fares were like the spark that start the cycle of crisis in October 2019. So I think there's this moment of opportunity because you don't have the region inserted into global commodity chains or the production networks in the same way, that there is this opening because neoliberal governments don't have an answer. These strategies won't work because in order for them to work, you need to understand how global production has been shaped by geopolitics over the past 20 years and the rise of China. You still have the problem of resource extraction and the fact that lots of Latin America, South America in particular, is inserted into this chain as a source of basically cheap resources. But there is a political opportunity there. And I think that too much of the debate amongst particular circles have concentrated on the end of the progressive cycle or the end of governments like Evo Morales's, and the rise of the far right or neoliberal regimes, and not enough focus has been done of where are the moments of opportunity, the possibilities, the fact that Latin America is going through another lost decade, and it doesn't have the same kind of pathways or stages of industrialization that you see elsewhere in the world. And I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. I think that this is an opportunity to do something different. And I think we should be looking at Latin America, somewhere which has shown us in the past 20 years that it is willing to try to do something different. As somewhere that actually maybe because of this kind of lesser kind of industrial position within the global economy, it might be a place of hope.
Yeah, that's kind of the way what I was taking away from it is it sounds like a beautiful opportunity for the people there not to be exploited and to take control, have a more autonomous government. What you're saying sounds like hope there.
Yeah, I think you have to have a little bit of hope. Otherwise, what's the point? And I think that there will be real opportunities in that the rise of China is something that has become very palpable over the past 5 years, almost intensified by the pandemic. I have been surprised that no one's writing about kind of Green New Deal, shift of kind of energy landscapes, move from hydrocarbons to green energy, which is going to throw up an entire kind of new geopolitical nexus as we stop fighting over oil and start fighting over other resources and other forms of getting energy. I think the Chinese have a first stage advantage in this, and that the Americans saying that you have to make your own superconductors might just play into their hands. It also means that places like Latin America could all of a sudden see themselves losing their primary source of export revenue and saying, well, actually, we're going to do something completely different here. And so this opens, both the move to China and the move away from hydrocarbons is part of this opportunity that I see. And I think that this is going to be shaped by struggles on the ground in Latin America, and the type of alliances that the working classes can build and the labor movement can build with indigenous movements, with other sections of the working poor, particularly the kind of like urban working poor, landless movements. And I think this is going to be really interesting over the next 20, 25 years.
I'm going to shut up, Jacob, so you can ask them questions. But I'm kind of bogarting the process. My apologies.
No, not at all, not at all. I'm really enjoying it. I was wondering. I only had two more questions, I think, and those were. I was wondering if we could backtrack just a little bit and talk about maybe some of the. Back into the Morales government, maybe some of, we talked about that, the labor movements were kind of co-opted and some of their demands were co-opted and fulfilled, but in a kind of half-hearted way. I was wondering if you could talk about because my understanding is that even the half-heartedness of the concessions still produced real material gains for the people of Bolivia. And my understanding is that the people of Bolivia really prospered under the Morales government. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and talk about how the labor movement saw itself amidst the kind of growing prosperity, or again, if that's just wrong, then correct me. And then my last question is like, what can us here in the labor movement in America, in Alabama, what can we learn from the labor movement in Bolivia? David and I are both on the Labor Federation here in North Alabama. I'm the Secretary Treasurer. He's a delegate. He's the president of his local. He was the Secretary Treasurer for the State Council of Machinists. We have a foothold here in North Alabama, so we'd like to kind of get a lessons learned and see what your recommendations would be from what's been going on in Bolivia to us. So so that was a lot there, but the first one was, what were some of the material gains that working people had in Bolivia from the concessions of the Morales government, and how did the labor movement view itself in light of those gains for working people?
I think it's important to stress that, I don't think Morales implemented those games half-heartedly. I think more it was kind of a technocratic implementation of demands. And as you said, did have real material gains. I mean, renegotiating the hydrocarbons contract did mean that the state all of a sudden had more money than it's ever had in its history in order to spend on infrastructure projects. So there are now highways between all the major cities, electrification improved. Water and gas provision in the cities improved. You saw rising kind of minimum wage, which is really important for particularly formalized working classes, which increased kind of, from about 500 Bolivianos a month, which is about just $150 a month to over 2,000.
Wow.
Yeah, so a fourfold increase over 10 years.
Was that mainly from the hydrocarbon exportation?
Yeah, the state had an official policy which increased the minimum wage. And what that had, it had a knock-on effect on wages in the informal sector, because aggregate demand went up, and so the amount of money flowing through the economy. So what hydrocarbons rent did was basically kind of heat up the effective demand and mean that people working in informal services and commerce all of a sudden had more customers, and so made more money, better access to credit. So if we're talking about kind of like along capitalist lines, things did really improve. The problem is that it wasn't the radical project that people hoped it would be. And it wasn't the radical project that movements asked for. And it was replete with all kinds of contradictions, principally the contradiction between having a resource-led development model, which exposes you to the ups and downs of global commodity prices, which they learned to their peril when global commodity prices collapsed come 2013, 2014. But it also pits the mass government against certain sections of the indigenous movement who they are supposedly representing. So Evo Morales was positioned himself as the first indigenous president of Bolivia. And it's a real problem if you have an indigenous president who represents all indigenous peoples all of a sudden fighting indigenous peoples. And it starts to undermine the legitimacy and undermine the political project of the mass. And these contradictions are some of the central contradictions that lead to the context where you have the coup d'etat last year. And so I think it's important to recognize that there were important material gains for lots of people in kind of measurable indicators, but that firstly, there was this moment, this opportunity lost. And secondly, this development model was unsustainable over the medium term. And so I think we have to look at Evo Morales' government as far from being faultless in what happened last year, and kind of suffering from a number of shortcomings that part of them are symptomatic of trying to run a socialist project inside a liberal state. Part of it is to do with the peripheral position of Bolivia within the capitalist global economy. But also part of it is to do with the political project and the decisions made by the mass government. And so we can't absolve Morales of the mistakes that he did definitely make. And I think this leads on to your second question nicely, because there are some really important lessons for the labor movement to learn from Bolivia. Firstly, alliances matter. And building alliances beyond the labor movement are the way, and repositioning yourself in a changing world can be really, really powerful. So looking at the US conjecture now, how are labor movements involved with Black Lives Matter, which is the kind of movement which has the most radical potential in the country and has the opportunity to kind of like really throw things wide open. And it's not to say that labor movements are going to be the drivers of that process. They're not. It's just how can you be good allies? How can you position yourselves in such a way that you start to build connections between these problems which seem disparate, but are actually kind of really interconnected. And we can see this by people talking about kind of abolish the police is a great example of how people have started to kind of like draw the threads of systemic racism, policing, and racial capitalism. And I think this is really, really powerful and a site of potential kind of opportunity for the US labor movement. Second lesson, I think, is more to do with how should labor movements position themselves vis-a-vis sympathetic governments. And I think this is kind of appropriate to say, given that there are elections in the US currently underway. And I think that the strategy of movements, you have to change whether it's Trump or Biden, but when Biden gets into power, you need to keep some critical distance from the government. You need to maintain your leadership vis-a-vis basis. And this means that doing the organizing work that's the bread and butter of labor movements, drawing people in, building something which is long lasting, where you have a proper organizational structure that can mobilize over certain issues, is going to be the key. Because governments have to respond to lots of different groups at once. They're going to be put in positions where they're going to make difficult decisions, and the labor movement needs to position itself as one of these countervailing forces to say, hang on a minute, like this is bad for this section of the US working classes, or this is an act of US imperialism, you should not do this. And I think that keeping this critical distance is something that labor movements should always bear in mind. So even if you have an opportunity to enter into alliance or cozy up or build kind of more formal bridges with the government, you still need to position yourself critically and to keep the channels of communication transparent and open with your rank and file, so the rank and file knows exactly who you're speaking to in government, what you're saying to them, and how you're positioning yourselves as their representatives.
Yep.
Right. I think a couple things that I wanted to tease out there in your answer, and I really appreciated that, was the transparent and democratic communications between labor leaders and government officials. I think that's incredibly important. And I think circling back to something that you said earlier in the interview, you said that all of your friends in the labor movement in Bolivia were canned basically for being dissident voices against the mass. But these are the people that had strong social support or strong support among the base of workers. And so what I gather from that is that these unions, and you said it, I didn't gather it, you said it, they're very hierarchical, and they're not necessarily, they're not as democratic as one would hope. And if they were democratic, these people would not have been kicked out. These people would not have been expelled because they had bases of support. And so I think this is something that we see lots of good labor organizers advocating, is increasing democracy and transparency within our unions where it can be, where that can be done. And I think that's very important. And the second is the maintaining the critical distance. You mentioned the labor movement kind of became like a headless organization because their leaders went into positions with the government. And I'm kind of agnostic on whether or not that's a good thing. It sounds like it's really not, but ideally you would have more than one leader that could lead the base. I'm seeing, especially today, I'm seeing lots of unions, lots of labor federations saying things that, in all honesty, are just silly about Joe Biden. Like really, really silly things. Uncritical support for Joe Biden. And I voted for Joe Biden today. I believe David did a while ago, but the support is critical.
Well, I mean, what choice did we have?
Right.
There was no choice.
There's a difference between kind of not going out there and canning Biden and saying don't vote for Biden, or doing things which undermines him in a strategically silly way. So if you're a labor movement coming out today and saying I support Biden, vote Biden today, is different from being like Biden is the best thing, he's greatest for the labor movement, you should definitely vote for him because he's our guy. And I think the two things are slightly different. And I think what's important to recognize is you need a strategy which comes bottom up rather than top down. And then this is what you start to see in Bolivia under Evo Morales, is that it's not that the unions aren't democratic. It's just that there are moments in time where the democracy falls apart because it's either the union democracy or their relationship with the government, and they decide to go with their relationship with the government, and all of the stuff which is kind of keeping their relationship with their rank and file a healthy relationship falls apart. And it's really interesting because I find that these friends who are really critical of Morales were the first people who I saw being like, yeah, it was a coup. And so it doesn't mean that you can't come out and say that you support a candidate, but the support is kind of conditional and it's based on a conjecture. And if if the time comes when you need to hold that leader to account, you need to be able to quickly and decisively say that this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and come out against that leader in a position which is going to pit you against that sympathetic politician.
Right.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what we've seen, my 30 some odd years in the labor movement, from basically the time that I was old enough to work, is we have one party that we supported historically throughout my entire life. You don't have anyone else you can put pressure on, because we know the Republican Party, we cannot, there are no pressure points for us to put on them. And so they developed the relationship out of necessity, but it's also, it was kind of like I was on a show last night, and we were talking about one of the organizers was organizing for some actions in the street in case Trump didn't accept the election. And the question posed was, well, what happens if he does? And he had the best response of anybody I've heard in years. He said, we still march because we're going to hold the Biden campaign as, to the same standards that we would hold anyone else. And that is what needs to happen in the U.S. and something that has not happened for years. Is we think that once we get our candidate that we've supported or endorsed into office, the fight is over. And unfortunately, in leadership positions, it has been for them, but it should have just begun, because we've elected these neoliberal Democrats for the past 40 years that just absolutely decimated the working class in the U.S. and seen stagnant wages, seen offshoring of jobs to exploitative countries and things like that. So, yeah, what you're saying as far as keeping an arm's reach, I think it needs to be keep a fist's reach and a very strong grasp on their, a stick of dynamite or a strong grasp on their throat to remind them of who put them in office.
And, and I think it's really, I think the fact that you see all of these just uncritical support for Biden or for other Democrats like Biden saying, oh, he's the best guy, I'm not at all opposed. And that has been my message that, Biden is who we should vote for, because he's going to be better for working people than Trump, but that's it. I'm not saying that he's the best guy, but there are unions and labor federations out there that are doing that, and I think what I would figure the thinking there is that, oh well, if we have critical support, people won't understand or it won't mobilize people out to vote, and I think that's just so disrespectful to our members and to the intelligence of our members, because they lived through Obama. They lived through Clinton. And if we have our leadership up here telling us Joe Biden is going to usher in a worker's paradise if we just elect him, I mean, it's really disrespectful in my view, and undemocratic and all sorts of things.
And it's one of the reasons why you've seen such a drastic drop in union worker support of union-endorsed politicians, because over the past 40 years they've recognized that these politicians that they have endorsed have been detrimental to their family's income. And so it's very apparent why I have 60% Republican voting membership, because they're sick and tired of listening to the unions endorse candidates that they won't hold the task.
Yeah. Angus, do you have any closing thoughts? I've really enjoyed the interview. I think those were some really good takeaways for the labor movement here in America and in Alabama. Did you have any closing thoughts for us, for the audience?
Just thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you guys. And it's really nice to be able to speak across contexts. Bolivia's labor movement is fascinating.
Yeah.
They have a long inspirational history that is often overlooked. And so it's really good to visit this, and particularly in a pertinent political moment. I feel like there are so many resonances and lessons that can be learned from what we've been talking about. So thank you both for having me, and best of luck with your organizing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.